I want you to imagine for a moment at the start of our service that you are a police detective investigating a crime, say an armed robbery. Lindsay's reading, oh, this is the service for me, isn't it? Imagine you have two witnesses who both witnessed the crime, but from different ends of the streets on which it took place. And there's lots of different obstacles, there's cars and vans and trees and things in the way. And so you take their statements, as you naturally would, and see that their accounts of the crime that took place are similar in some details, but wildly different in others. Why is that? Is it to do with the different positions they were in and their different vantage points, meaning they each saw something that the other one didn't, as well as some things they both saw the same? Is one of the witnesses perhaps not very good at remembering details precisely, or gets a bit confused about certain key things that happened and all the shock and drama of what happened? Maybe one of them is just simply making it all up. Do both accounts combined give a more complete overall picture of what actually happened, or do they actually contradict and confuse one another? Fortunately, I'm glad I'm not a police detective, but I am someone who studies the Bible quite a bit. And if you are one of those people who's interested in reading scholarly works that take a critical analysis of the Bible and the New Testament, and in particular the Nativity accounts, it's a bit problematic, particularly Luke's. There are a few things which don't quite fit historically. Certain events in Luke's Nativity story don't really make sense when subject to scrutiny. Now, I don't plan on going on to that in detail this morning, as I know some of these criticisms and objections are typically the views of one group of commentators, whereas other commentators reconcile the inconsistencies and differing accounts. But there's no escaping the fact that in their respective nativity accounts, Matthew and Luke have some very, very different things taking place for what is supposedly the same event. Matthew has the visits of the Magi, Herod's slaughter of the innocents, the dramatic escape to Egypt. Why doesn't Luke include these surely important events in his account? And why is there no mention of shepherds in Matthew? Why does the angel appear to Joseph but not Mary? I think, like all authors, Matthew and Luke wrote with specific purposes in mind. Each wanted to tell the story of Jesus' life in their own particular way, to highlight particular themes of Jesus' ministry, to emphasize particular parallels between Jesus' ministry and the Old Testament history, and so on. And it's in these differences and the uniqueness of the material presented to us by each author that we can best see what they want us to look out for this Christmas, and particularly Luke, which is who we're looking at today. Now, perhaps surprisingly, confusingly almost, the first characters that Luke introduces us to in his gospel aren't Mary and Joseph or even Jesus, but Zechariah and Elizabeth. Both are described in chapter 1 as righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Now, when we think about the gospel authors, it's fairly common to take a sort of high-level view to think of Matthew as the author predominantly writing for a Jewish audience. He's very technical in describing Jewish customs and practices, and it often seems as if he is at pains to link to the Old Testament scriptures. In the Nativity account, he refers to several prophecies which seem to refer to a different time and events, and yet he explicitly links them to Jesus. The reference to Jewish roots is important for Matthew. By comparison, Luke's Gospel and his follow-on work, the Acts of the Apostles, is often regarded as being written for a predominantly Gentile audience. And yet to make these assumptions is to overlook just how deeply Luke steeps his nativity and infancy narrative in the Old Testament world. Zechariah is described as being of the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth is named as a descendant of Aaron. They are a righteous and important religious couple, like Nicky and Pippa Gumble or Stephen and Katie Kurt. But the setting for this opening passage is the temple in Jerusalem. Luke's gospel begins and ends in Jerusalem. It's described by theologians as the city of destiny for Jesus and the pivot for the salvation of mankind. It's not only the place where Jesus died and rose and ascended, it's also the place where salvation has been accomplished and from which witnesses go out into the whole world. And the infancy narrative in Luke reflects this emphasis. It begins with Zechariah offering incense in the Jerusalem temple, and it ends with the child Jesus, 12 years old, speaking his first recorded words in the temple and amazing all who were in there. There is this significant concentration on Jerusalem in the temple, and this is deliberate by the author in terms of setting out his goals for writing his gospel. Jerusalem and the temple enjoyed an historic importance both for Judaism and as the place where Christianity began. But for Luke, they are also the symbols of the people of Israel. Jerusalem becomes the pivotal place in Luke's account. The temple, it's the centre of Jewish devotion and worship, and the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist occurs in the most holy place where God speaks through an angel. It was a place where all the people came to pray, a place where it would be possible for God to hear and respond to prayer, and consequently where a revelation, a proclamation from God might be expected. And Luke wants the reader to know that right from the start, Christianity does not depart from Judaism, but is firmly rooted within it. But it's not just this geographical and physical setting of the narrative that's important. The characters that we encounter are as well. And Luke further incorporates Old Testament parallels and motifs into his nativity account. It's said that there's a very strong parallel between Zechariah and Elizabeth and Abraham and Sarah. But Luke isn't trying to present his gospel as merely a continuation of the old. Rather, he wants to show that this is the turning point in history. This is the time of a crux in history when we transition from the old Abrahamic faith and covenant into a new covenant. Elizabeth is old and seemingly incapable of having children. She perhaps feels an overwhelming sense of shame about this. The assumption was probably that either she or her ancestors had somehow behaved in such a way that God was punishing them by making Elizabeth barren. In the Old Testament, the only person similarly affected is Sarah, the wife of Abraham. And the pattern of the birth announcements of both John the Baptist and Jesus reflect those of the announcements of Ishmael and Isaac and Samson in the Old Testament. There's the appearance of an angel or the Lord to someone, the mother or the father. Fear on the part of the person being confronted by this heavenly figure. The heavenly message itself, an objection or disbelief raised by the person receiving the announcement, or perhaps a request for a sign, and then the giving of some sign or reassurance. Just as Abraham, rather than Sarah, received the announcement of the birth of Isaac, so Zechariah, rather than Elizabeth, received similar information through the appearance of the angel. Zechariah's objection, now, how can I be sure of this? I'm an old man and my wife is well on in years. It mirrors Abraham's question in Genesis chapter 15. Sovereign Lord, how can I know? Luke describes how Zechariah is someone who faithfully followed God's commandments, echoing how Abraham is similarly described in Genesis. Later on in the infancy narrative, we see how Mary is told of Elizabeth's pregnancy. That's the sign she's given, which concludes with Gabriel's statement that with God, nothing is impossible. He says, "For no word from God will ever fail," reflecting the words said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And when Elizabeth gives birth, her friends and family rejoice with her, just as they did with Sarah in Genesis chapter 21. All these parallels show, I think, how deliberately Zechariah and Elizabeth are portrayed by Luke as a kind of modern-day Abraham and Sarah at the time he was writing. The theological significance of this lies in the importance attached to the Old Testament, to God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, which Zechariah himself refers to later on in chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel. But what's important is that once this link, these firm roots in the Jewish faith are established, I think Luke really does go overboard on this, because it makes it important for him. What's important is that the reader of Luke's Gospel then recognizes that we are at a turning point. The foundation of Israel was established in the covenant with Abraham. But by portraying Zechariah and Elizabeth as a new Abraham and Sarah, Luke seems to be asserting that the covenant will then start anew through their son, John. And this is the task which God has prepared John for. And this is where we understand the purpose, I think, more clearly of Luke's Gospel, and in particular, his nativity accounts. To prepare the introduction of Jesus. We've had all of this about John the Baptist and Elizabeth and Zechariah. Finally, we actually get to the birth of Jesus. Ultimately, Jesus' coming, while rooted in Israel, requires a new creation or renewal of the covenants made with Abraham and the patriarchs. And I think this is the first thing that Luke wants us to look out for this Christmas. John is to prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah. He's described as being in the spirit and power of the prophet Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. I think by contrast, the announcement of Jesus' birth is very similar to that of John the Baptist, but much less detailed. There is the same structure: the angel appearing, Mary being afraid, the angel telling her not to be afraid, the announcement that Mary will be pregnant despite this seemingly being impossible, the name of the child being given, and the name's significance, a request for a sign, and the giving of a sign to provide reassurance. I think Mary gets the better deal being told the sign is your cousin is pregnant, rather than Zechariah's sign, you're going to be mute for the next 9 months. Luke, I think, reserves much more detail for the actual birth and events surrounding the birth of Jesus. And it's here where we see the second thing Luke wants us to look out for this Christmas. And it kind of feels like all this setup for the coming of a Saviour and God's new saving covenant for all in the previous chapter is perhaps just a little bit of an anticlimax when you get to the actual birth of Jesus. Because we have not got a mighty Saviour, but a tiny baby. We don't have the Magi bringing precious, expensive gifts, but poor, humble shepherds visiting the baby Jesus. And it all takes place in Bethlehem. Not Jerusalem, which is so important to Luke, but Bethlehem. And this was an unusual place for the Messiah to be born. It was a small, inauspicious town. The Messiah, the promised Saviour King, should surely have been born in Jerusalem, in a palace. But instead, he arrived in a room for the animals and laid in a manger, where the animals fed from. Really, there's nothing particularly special about the actual birth of Jesus. There are angels appearing out in the fields nearby, terrifying the shepherds at first, but they're not actually present at Jesus' birth. You'd surely expect that this herald of angels praising God would be at the actual birth of Jesus, if they're going to be anywhere. It might be a bit crowded in the room, but as far as Mary and Joseph and Jesus are concerned, actually it's all rather ordinary. And there's certainly not this dramatic flight to Egypt a few days later. Matthew and Luke's birth narratives portray Jesus in, I think, quite different ways. For Matthew, he sees Jesus as this Davidic king who presents a threat to Israel's rulers right from the moment of his birth, where Herod tries to do away with him. For Luke, however, Jesus is of more humble origins. Jesus isn't a threat to Caesar, or at least not yet. And he's much more closely associated with the temple and priesthood than a royal throne. Some commentators see Luke invoking the image of Samuel in his nativity and infancy narrative of Jesus. Samuel's was also a miraculous birth. He was left in the temple as a boy, and from an early age his tender words astounded the wise. I think for Luke, Jesus' birth doesn't signal the arrival of a Moses-like leader that perhaps Matthew portrays, but of a Samuel-like servant, a boy who may not be an immediate threat to men like Herod, but who will ultimately turn the world upside down by means of his life and teaching. Equally important to note is Luke's association of Jesus with the poor. While Matthew actually has Joseph residing in a house, Luke has him lodge in a guest room. While Matthew has Jesus visited by wise men, Luke has him visited by shepherds. And while Matthew has Jesus being given gold and precious spices as gifts at his birth, Luke just has him taken to the temple, along with a poor man's sacrifice when it was time for the purification rites. These details, exclusive to Luke, are significant for what he wants us to look for this Christmas. As far as Luke is concerned, it's fair to say the gospel is fundamentally for the poor and the downtrodden, as witnessed in the choice of shepherds to be the first to share the good news of Jesus' birth. A favourite Christmas carol of many people's, Angels from the Realms of Glory, which also tells the story of the shepherd's encounter with the angel of the Lord, contains these words in its second verse. Shepherds in the field abiding, watching o'er your flocks by night, God with us is now residing, yonder shines the infant light. God with us. Matthew makes that point explicitly by referring to Jesus as Emmanuel. But I think Luke shows us what it means for God to be with us. Jesus was born into this world just like any other child at the time, mostly not knowing riches or status or authority, but everyday life like you and I. He grew up. He would have been taught. He would have had friends. He would have got a job and he would have worked. He knew what it was like to be you and me. Jesus came to this world to live with us, to be one of us, to be a part of us, and to save us. Because despite all the wrong things we've done, God didn't abandon us. He saved us. At Christmas time, God is with us. The long-expected Saviour lived an unexpected life. We perhaps expected a king, a leader, a mighty Saviour, and instead we got a man. And the way he saved us was not by starting a war or winning a battle, but by dying. Because the truth is we needed saving. And God did the most surprising thing. He sent his own son, who was born a child, lived as a man, died as a betrayed friend, and yet rose again as the victorious Lord of life, conquering sin and death, to give you the greatest present of all, forgiveness and life eternal. Emmanuel, God with us, God with you. At Christmas, Luke shows us Jesus' humanity. He shows us that God cares about you, where you are, and who you are. God knows you and is with you in your job, at school, at church. He's with us when we do the washing up or go and buy groceries in the supermarket. And he's with us when we buy a new car or go to visit a friend in the hospital. He's with us when we have to lock ourselves away in the bathroom to get away from our kids who are driving us crazy. And he's with us when our marriage hits a rough patch. And he's with us when life breaks our heart in half. And he's with you when you feel lonely. He's with us when we pretend we're something we're not, and that image comes collapsing down around us. He's with us when we have plenty, and he's with you when you're lacking. He's with you, always with you, because he loves you, and he sent his Son to earth 2 millennia ago to save you. Jesus was born for the likes of the shepherds, the poor and lonely, the rejected and forgotten of society. Jesus was born too for the wealthy and the wise who worshipped him at his birth. He was born for every individual person with their individual circumstances and unique experiences and traits. Luke surprises us with his account of the Nativity. And at a time when in this world there are so many shocking things going on and people asking, where is God in all of this? The answer is just as surprising. He is already here among us, God with us, God in us, Emmanuel. God can be seen in the responses to when things go wrong. God is there when people seek peace rather than conflict, when people feed rather than ignore the hungry and helpless, when people care for rather than destroy God's creation. And sometimes these responses can powerfully surprise those who don't think it matters that God sent his Son to be born into this world as our Saviour. This Christmas, will you be overjoyed by the surprising gift God has given you? A new covenant, forgiveness of sins, salvation from a God who knows you and knows what it's like to live a life on earth. But will you also see how you could respond? Would you be willing to surprise even yourself by what you might do to bring God's love to a world desperately in need? How will you let God use you this Christmas? What are you looking out for? Let the promise of God with us be true this Christmas.